Hi, everybody. It's 6:30, so I just wanted to pop on and do a really brief welcome. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I will turn it over to Chad Lewis, who we are so excited to have as a guest tonight. So thanks, everybody.
Well, hello and welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here tonight. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about the bizarre history of Wisconsin from the safety of wherever you're watching this program from. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Just bear with me 1 second here as I get this going. So hopefully all of you can see the bizarre history of Wisconsin on the title slide. And that's the program hopefully you're all here for. As you heard, my name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter this evening. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 20 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires over in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, reports of abductions, really odd people, weird places, you name it. If it's just offbeat and a little strange, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But what I found on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore this evening. Some of Wisconsin's strangest history that's been hidden for many years that you might not know about. Mainly, we're going to look at the time frame of the late 1800s, early 1900s. For the next 45 or 50 minutes, we'll take a tour of the entire state. At any time, if you have questions, you can throw them into the chat room. And at the end of the program, we will address the questions, comments, or stories from all of you as well. If you listen to the rest of the country, they believe that we here in Wisconsin are weird in our own right. Because if you believe the rest of the country, everyone in Wisconsin's a dairy farmer. We are all crazy Packer fans. We do nothing but eat cheese and drink beer. And even though this last one may be true, I'm going to be talking about a different type of Wisconsin, a far weirder, more bizarre, and sometimes more sinister version of the state. I'm going to be tackling some of the weirdest and strangest stories you will ever hear coming out of our state. So what exactly are we going to explore this evening? Well, everything from bizarre deaths and ghosts all the way down to peculiar people and UFOs. So much weirdness that we would make the great late Wisconsin folklorist Charles E. Brown, photographed here, happy in his grave at what we're discussing. I've also thrown in what I call keep in minds, things about the state you just might not have known. For instance, in the era in which I'm talking about, there were only about 775,000 people in the state. Today, we have nearly 6 million people in our state, meaning back then, they had a lot more room to spread out and be weird. And believe me, they took full advantage of that space. First up, bizarre deaths. Today, if you open up your newspaper and flip to the obituary section, you will probably see something similar to this. Old Man Lewis died peacefully surrounded by his loving family. No information, no cause of death, no details whatsoever. But the era in which I was looking into, I was finding different obituaries because I was finding things like this. Suicide is gruesome. Whole top of his head blown off by the blast. Quite a bit different than dying peacefully surrounded by your loving family. And it got me thinking about how they viewed death in the old days. And they really wanted headlines. They didn't really care the cause of death. They wanted to sell newspapers, which is why you got stories like this one. Cold bath causes death. Talks about a woman in Beloit had the habit of taking a cold bath every morning. Then one morning she died. It was either a brain aneurysm or a heart attack, but that didn't sell newspapers. Cold bath causes death did. And I chose this as our first story tonight for two reasons. One, it's going to come back later in the program. A gentleman must have read this story, and we'll catch up with him a little bit later. But two, it was said to have happened in Beloit. But I didn't find it in the Beloit newspapers. I found it in my hometown of Eau Claire's newspapers. And this happened quite a bit. A story might have said to have happened in Madison, but it was in the Superior newspapers, or vice versa. So half the fun on tonight's program is debating whether or not you believe these stories. Maybe this really happened, or maybe it was a slow news day in Eau Claire, and they made the story up knowing that in 1903, nobody would Google it to see if it was true. But when these people passed on, you don't have to feel too bad for them because the life expectancy back then was only 47 years of age. This next case, I have dozens of these. It's out of Kenosha, and it talks about a man claiming he was going to die the following Thursday. He had a premonition. And sure enough, when Thursday came, he died. I have a lot of these cases where people predicted down to the hour of how they would die. And lo and behold, they actually died. What I love about this story is that the newspaper went on to report that before he died, this gentleman went out and did one last thing. And that last thing was he went out and paid off every single one of his debts so that when he died, he could die with a clear name. Take that versus today. If somebody knows they're going to die, they're probably on a cruise or a vacation, much different than it was in the old days. But if you died, in one aspect, you were lucky because many people had the fear of actually being buried alive. It was such a fear in the 18 and early 1900s. But is it anything more than an urban legend, a folklore? Well, was anyone ever buried alive? For that, we know yes, thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem a little silly today with modern science and medicine, but our grandparents were so terrified, they came up with several inventions to stop this. My favorite is this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like it would do. It was a bell that you could have above your grave with a rope on a pole going down into your casket. So if you awoke in time, all you'd have to do is tug that rope. It would ring the bell and alert the caretaker that you had been buried alive, the caretaker living at that location during those days, and they could come and rescue you. But there was one problem with this invention, though. On many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare, thinking everyone had been buried alive. In fact, after your loved one passed away, it was your responsibility to sit around their grave, making sure that they were truly dead, that they wouldn't rise up from the ground. But I'm going to stop talking about deaths right now, not because I don't find them fascinating, I do, but because it's dangerous. I found dozens of cases where people merely talked about death when they dropped dead, as though all it takes is a discussion about death before the Grim Reaper comes after you. So I'm going to move on to our next category while I still can. And that category is ghosts and haunted places. You can't throw a rock in Wisconsin without hitting a place that is thought to be haunted. One of my favorites is right outside of Menominee, a place called Mary Dean, an island on the river named after a young girl by the name of Mary Dean who drowned while coming up on a steamship many years ago. It was said that she was buried in an unmarked grave on the island. At one time, an entire town lived out on the island. They had a post office, many businesses. The only way to get there was by ferry back and forth. But since the drowning of young Mary Dean, many claim she haunts the island and the river, because many witnesses have reported seeing her spirit out in the middle of the water like some sort of siren, trying to entice them in to help her, where she'll say things like, "Help me, I'm drowning. Save me, I can't swim. Please don't leave me." Legend is, if you're foolish enough or brave enough to go out into the water, she will pull you under and you will meet your watery grave and spend eternity in the river with Mary Dean. It's also out on the island that you can camp. You don't need to register. You don't need to pay. You can simply just go out there and camp. And I have to tell you, it's a fun camping experience, especially if you wander into the river at night looking for the spirit of Mary Dean. One second as my computer catches up. Here we go. So in 1874, the good people of the Fox Valley, when they woke up and read this obituary about Mrs. George Miller, would have no idea that this would become one of Wisconsin's most infamous hauntings. And it takes place in Riverside Cemetery in Appleton. And it's here that the gravestone of Kate Blood, Mrs. Miller. It was said that when she was alive, Kate murdered her husband and their 3 young children. Therefore, she would not be allowed burial inside the cemetery proper, which is why she's off by the river by herself. If you were not specifically looking for her grave, you probably wouldn't find it. But that's not the scary part. The scary part comes in the fact that many people who venture out here report all sorts of oddities taking place, including seeing what appears to be some type of hooded black figure standing behind the gravestone. When they try to get a closer look or snap a photo of this thing, it simply vanishes right before their eyes. Others will see mysterious balls of light dancing through the area. They hear disembodied voices, and they have all kinds of oddities happen when they walk the path to get to the Stations of the Cross. So I spent months and months researching this case to find out that Kate Blood did not murder her husband. Well, actually, I just read the tombstone. You can see here that her husband lived much longer than she did. But that hasn't stopped the story from progressing and morphing. Now the legend tells that if you go out to this gravestone, and if you're very quiet and you wait, you will see what appears to be blood oozing out of the gravestone. I say it appears to be blood because witnesses I've spoken with claim that when they went to touch it, it was dry to the touch, even though they swore it was blood oozing out of the tombstone. I'll leave it up to you to visit Kate Blood and determine for yourself whether or not blood oozes out of her gravestone. I love this category, medical anomalies. Today, we could probably explain some of these things, but back then, they had no idea what was going on. A case like this, man turns white out of Kenosha. It was a tanning employee who was suddenly turning black. They thought it was due to some chemical action at his tannery he worked at. doctors were usually puzzled. I have all kinds of these stories of people changing colors from Caucasian looking to African American and back. Doctors had no idea what was going on back then. But remember, it was the early 1900s, so they weren't as advanced in the sciences as we are today. But I find it amazing that so many people were changing colors back then. Keep in mind, the hamburger was invented in Seymour, Wisconsin, just one of the many, many inventions that we lay claim to here in Wisconsin. This next case is what I call good news, bad news. And as you'll read here, it talks about a woman from Wausau who went blind 20 years ago, and then suddenly she regained her ability to see. And I have dozens of these reports of people regaining something, whether it's their eyesight, their ability to walk or talk. And doctors were unable to explain it. As you can see here, they thought it was an act of providence, an act of God, a spiritual, spontaneous healing. They didn't know anything else to call it. But I call these good news, bad news, because the good news is that somebody always gets something back. The bad news is, just like in this case, about 99% of the time, somebody's going to pass on after regaining their lost ability. So the good news is you can see again. The bad news is you're going to see the Grim Reaper coming for you very shortly. Or what about this odd case of flesh like bone? You can see this woman out of Kenosha. All of a sudden, her flesh was turning to bone. The newspaper said you could knock on her flesh, and it was knocking like it was on hard concrete or stone. A lot of the time, these stories weren't followed up on. I tried to find out what happened to a lot of these people, and there was no follow-up story whatsoever, as though the story came and it disappeared just as quickly. Imagine opening up your newspaper today and reading this headline: "Is a human monster. Child is half dog and half man." Luckily, the mother still seemed to love it. As you can read, the body was covered with hair, had a long projecting nose and a low forehead. But here's the best part. The last sentence saying that the mother was scared by a dog jumping on her about a month ago. During this time period, if a woman was pregnant and if she was scared by any animal, whether it was an elephant or a snake, in some weird maternal imprinting, it was said that the child would come out looking like the animal that had scared the mother. So, of course, this animal was a dog, so the child came out looking like a dog. 1905, the problem is there's no photograph that's known of this new half dog, half man being born. Most likely it was not half dog, half man. Most likely it was a child born with a genetic disorder called hypertrichosis, which affected people will grow hair mainly on their face and upper torso. Usually these kids would be put on display as freaks of nature, as they were called, back in the dime museums, and they would make their living sitting there talking and engaging with the general public. If they were very lucky, their parents would allow them to run off with people like P.T. Barnum from the Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus, and later Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. And their parents usually allowed them to go off and live with these carnivals and these men. The reason being is they would make a lot of money doing it, and the children would have a much better life than they would back on the farm in Wisconsin. In fact, at one point, P.T. Barnum and one of his freaks of nature, General Tom Thumb, photographed here, were two of the wealthiest men in America. But even though this probably wasn't a half dog, half human, there were other reports of half human, half other species, including this report from 1908 talking about a chicken being born with a human face. The hen had no bill, but a perfectly formed nose. Beneath the nostrils, it had a mouth and a chin, and it looked very human-like. But again, 1908, where's the photograph? We have no photograph of this chicken with a human face. But it's one thing to believe in half human, half dogs, but what about the mysterious creatures that were said to be roaming all over the state? These were creatures that science says doesn't exist. Skeptics say they can't exist. Yet every year, people in Wisconsin were coming face to face with these creatures. And we seem to have two groups of creatures. What are thought to be real unknown creatures, and then more of the lumberjack Northwoods creatures. Because keep in mind, Wisconsin claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before we get too excited, so do the states of Minnesota, California, Maine, Vermont, Michigan, and the country of Canada. But we all know Paul's from Wisconsin. And everybody knows the story of Paul and his sidekick, Babe the Blue Ox, but nobody is aware of how Paul actually met Babe. And he met Babe in the winter of the two winters. It was the winter of the blue snow. The reason it was blue is the weather was so terrible that people were cursing up a blue streak that turned all the snow blue. That's when Paul found Babe. It was so cold that winter. What's that? How cold was it? It was so cold that winter that fish grew fur to stay warm. That's when Paul found Babe, and Babe had turned blue from the blue snow, and Paul took him into his camp. And like everything around Paul Bunyan, Babe grew to an enormous size, and the two have been traveling the Northwoods ever since. Paul Bunyan's the most infamous lumberjack of all time. But the most infamous lumber creature was a creation of this gentleman, Eugene Shepard of Rhinelander, who claimed to have seen this beast out in the woods. He was a timber cruiser and would go into the woods scouting it out for lumber companies. That's when he came across the hodag, creature dragon-like with long horns, spikes down its back, huge tusks and fangs and claws. Eugene Shepard gathered together some of his hunting friends. They went out and captured one of these hodags. He brought it along to the county fair and a lot of the county festivals, charging admission to see the hodag. Once it was found out it was a hoax, Eugene Shepard said, yes, I hoaxed it, but only because I wasn't able to capture the real thing, which is still out there in the woods. So these are more of what we think of as lumberjack creatures, creatures that only exist in the spinning of yarns and tall tales by the old lumbermen. But then we have other creatures that are just as weird, but people think they might actually be here as a flesh and blood animal. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Wisconsin was overrun with reports of sea serpents. In fact, if you were a resort town in the late 1800s and you did not have a sea serpent story, you were behind the time because you were losing out on all these sea serpent stories that were attracting all of the tourists from Chicago. One sea serpent story is from where a lot of you are probably watching this from, Lake Wabeesa. Now, it's here that the stories date back to the early days of Wisconsin. A lot of the stories come from early people visiting the lake on a vacation or out on a fishing expedition, including one gentleman who was out on the lake when he saw what appeared to be a 60 to 70 foot long serpent coming toward him. He immediately paddled his boat back to the shoreline as fast as he could. A hunting party was gathered, but they had no luck in capturing this creature. Several other people over the years saw it as well. Of course, it led to speculation that it was the same creature that was also inhabiting Lake Monona in nearby Madison, because here this snake was said to be at least 20 feet long. Many fishermen saw it as well. One of my favorite stories happened in 1892. And you can see here, Mr. Morgan, the legend is, was out fishing on his own when all of a sudden he saw a big log sticking out of the water. So he went over and put his foot on the log and was amazed to find that the log came to life, that it wasn't a log. It was a huge leviathan of the deep. He said that this creature, whatever it tended to be, was as large as a telephone pole and had his mouth as wide as a barrel that could easily swallow a human man without even any exertion. He got in a battle with this thing, pulled out his knife, said to have stabbed it 40 times, but the creature simply descended into the waters and disappeared. He wasn't sure if he had killed it or merely wounded it or just aggravated it, but he got out of the water as fast as he could. As of today, I've collected over 40 different lakes, rivers, and streams in Wisconsin that all have or had a legend of a sea serpent inhabiting them. Keep in mind, Green Bay has the distinction of being our oldest city, incorporated in 1754. But a lot of you might be traveling a lot and say, hey, wait a minute, Chad. I pass through Abbotsford quite a bit. They claim to be Wisconsin's first city. What gives here? Well, they're right. They are Wisconsin's first city. Alphabetically speaking, that is, which is why I never fall for their ruse. I always keep driving and avoid Abbotsford. What about this cool creature? A strange mix of a cat and a rabbit, the head belonging to that of a cat and the body to that of a rabbit. The only problem is, again, 1910, there's no photo. You would think somebody would have captured a photographic evidence of this new species, especially one as cool as part rabbit and part cat. But as far as we know, that photograph does not exist. Some of these stories were just so bizarre that they didn't fit into any one category. So I made their own category for them. Keep in mind of oddities, Old Abe, the Supernatural Bird. Now, my hometown of Eau Claire, one of our sporting teams is named the Old Abes, and there's a lot of memorials around the region for Old Abe, who was an eagle that was brought to the Civil War. Each state could bring something as their mascot, and Wisconsin claimed Old Abe as its mascot. And soon, Old Abe got a supernatural reputation that whoever was holding and carrying Old Abe would not be harmed or killed in battle. Southern generals said they'd rather kill Old Abe than to capture hundreds of Union soldiers, because that's what Old Abe did for the morale of the Union. After the war, Old Abe became a national hero. Eventually, when he passed, he was stuffed and they brought him to the Capitol in Madison. Unfortunately, he was lost when the Capitol burned, but they do have replica replacements of Old Abe. And if you ever find yourself in the Eau Claire area, you can find many memorials to the supernatural bird of the Civil War. I love this next oddity, and it involves the University of Whitewater, specifically their library, because it's here at the library where the legend is, under lock and key, the librarians keep a book, and it's the Book of the Dead, that if you check this mysterious book out, you or someone you know is going to die very shortly. Usually you, when you go crazy and either die at your own hands or the hands of a tragic accident. I don't know who keeps returning the book when these people die, but that's the legend. Every year, librarians contact me telling me that they have no book. Do not send people here looking for it. which is exactly what you would expect those sneaky librarians to tell you when you're trying to check this book out. So do so at your own risk and make sure you have someone ready to return it when you meet your fate after checking it out. Or what about this in Appleton? People woke up and found this weird horned toad all over the area. The oddity was that this toad was only found out in the western states of the US. How it got there, nobody knew. Skeptics claimed that what happened was that a storm or tornado spun around in Texas or California, scooped up these creatures, made its way to Wisconsin, lost steam and power, and dropped them in Appleton. The only problem with this is that this was the only type of creature that was found. There were no other animals, no frogs, no fish, nothing else was scooped up but these weird horned toads. We have a long history in Wisconsin of odd things falling from the sky, from fish to raining blood and an assortment of other oddities. Or what about this 8-foot skeleton that was found? The newspaper said it was actually 8 or 9 or maybe even bigger in height, had been unearthed. They thought it was somebody of great importance because of all the artifacts that were buried along with this person. But remember back then, being 9 feet tall would have truly been a giant, because in 1909, the average height of an American male was only 5 feet 6 inches. In fact, the largest person ever on record is that of Robert Waddle of Alton, Illinois. He died while he was still growing. He was a wee bit short of being 9 feet tall when he died. They have a life-size memorial to him in Alton, Illinois. You can go there and see how gigantic he truly was. They also have one at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Auditorium in Wisconsin Dells. They found him in what is known as an effigy mound. Researchers believe that we once had 20,000 of these, but we have many, many fewer of these now because of development and sprawl and the like. These were native burial grounds, sacred places, usually in the shape of an animal that could best be viewed from the sky. It was raised up in that shape. Luckily, we still have about 3,000 to 4,000 of these that still remain. Or what about this case where a young man went insane from reading too many religious books? Because everyone who came to visit him, he asked them if they wanted to talk to the guardian angels, that he could communicate with them. This went on so long, people thought he was insane. They actually locked him up in the insane asylum. But I don't think this young boy or this young man was insane. I think he was just ahead of his time. Because in 1905, if you told people you could communicate with angels, they would lock you in the insane asylum. But today, you can make a pretty good living giving angel readings to people, just showcasing again that he was just a few years ahead of his time. Keep in mind, in Wisconsin, during Prohibition era, every big name gangster of the day spent time here in Wisconsin. Everyone from Al Capone and John Dillinger to Babyface Nelson, Elvin Creepy Karpus, Ma Barker and the gang. You name it, if they were a well-known, infamous criminal, they spent time relaxing in robbing in Wisconsin. What about an animal committing suicide? That's exactly what happened in La Crosse when a dog went into Hutchinson's saloon. Apparently, they weren't very nice to it, kicked it and said, "Get out of here, you old mutt." The dog, according to witnesses, went down to the railroad tracks, put its head on the tracks, and it waited. And it waited. Eventually, a train came rumbling by. The engineer saw the dog, blew the whistle, tried to stop. The dog merely lifted its head, looked at the engineer, and then put it back, waited for the train to run it over. Those who saw it said it was an act of a dog committing suicide. Or how about a clock stopping when the owner dies? The clock had been in the family for 40 years. Then the grandfather passed away at 4:25. Anyone want to guess what time the clock stopped? You guessed it, 4:25. I still receive reports of these cases of people coming home from the hospital visiting a loved one who has passed to find that their clock at their home has stopped, or they get a call telling them about a friend or loved one moving on, and they look at their watch and their watch has stopped. How this happens, why it happens, we have no idea. Don't worry, you're not going to see any of your friends or neighbors in here because it's too long ago for them to be here. But Wisconsin, we have a long history of unique people, including the Ringling Brothers that staged their first show in Baraboo in 1884. And if you've never been to the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, you need to go. It's a real treasure. Not only do they have a circus going all summer long, non-COVID years, obviously, but they also have more circus memorabilia than anywhere else in the entire world. From the old wagons to the tapestry to the advertising, all of which is better than anywhere else you can get it in the entire globe. But we do have a unique history of weird people, including this gentleman. Now, if you're not familiar with this gentleman, this was Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, Wisconsin. And if you don't recall Ed's story back in the 1950s, you might recall some of the movies they based on his life, including Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and many, many others. Most people just think of Ed as a murderer, which he was, but before he was captured, he was well liked in Plainfield. Odd, but well liked. He would often babysit for kids and bring his neighbors over what he called a venison stew for them to eat. One neighbor told me he remembered his mother getting this stew, and it had such a horrible smell to it, she threw it away, which is good for her, because even though Ed was a killer, his real passion was to wait until it got dark. Then he would fire up his vehicle, head down to the nearby cemeteries, where he would dig up the remains of women that reminded him of his own deceased mother. He would then bring those back to his farmhouse where he lived in squalor. He would use them and turn them into lampshades and furniture. We won't even get into his bedroom antics at his place. He had skulls everywhere. But when Ed really got a bug in his system, he would make an entire outfit of this material, and he would wear it like a demented Halloween costume as he danced under the moonlight in his front yard. But when we caught Gein and discovered how truly horrific his crimes were, they wanted to open his house as a roadside attraction, a museum of horrors that you could go and visit. But before they were able to do so, it mysteriously burned to the ground. Townsfolk torched it, allegedly. When we found out how evil Gein was, it became a national monster. And he was, but 50 years before he was wearing human skin, a young girl in Madison was doing the same thing. She had gotten the skin from a friend of hers who was studying to be a doctor in Chicago. And the skin came from a man who was killed in the streets of Chicago. And she had made them into shoes. The newspaper said that wherever she went, people complimented her on her shoes, how beautiful they were. She said she had enough material left over that she was going to make a matching purse to go along with those shoes. What happened to the shoes? I don't know. Maybe they're in your attic or your basement right now. They've been lost to history. Keep in mind, we have nearly 15,000 lakes here in Wisconsin, which is more than the nearly 12,000 that Minnesota has, even though they're known as the land of 10,000 lakes. Although it's really a trick of how you count lakes, because if we count them for being size-wise, Minnesota has many, many more lakes than we do. We just count them a little bit different, so we can claim that we have more lakes than the land of 10,000 lakes. Remember, this was the first story we covered for the program. Cold bath causes death. This next gentleman must have read that story because he didn't like taking baths. In fact, you could say he hated it, so much so that he went 60 years without taking one. He was 62 years old, so you can do the math. But the best part was when the paper said the accumulation of 60 years of filth from Bailey's body is best left untold. The man just hated taking baths, and it may have saved his life. Who knows? Times were tough back then. But I think this next woman took it a step too far, because this woman had asked the dentist to remove her husband's false teeth after he died. And she wanted to take her dead husband's teeth out, not for a memorial for him, but she wanted the dentist to remold them and put them into her mouth. And the reason for that is she said, now that my husband is dead, I need to get back out there dating. And if I can get his teeth, I'll look a lot better and receive more suitors than I would on my own. And believe it or not, the dentist did it. He took out the teeth, remolded them into her mouth. I don't know if she was courting more after that or not, but it seemed a little too far for my taste. Psychic phenomena, weird things happening, like this cursed farm near Appleton, the McCarty farm. And they're talked about dozens of people who met with accidental and weird, bizarre deaths while living on this farm. As you can see, this story was from 1907, but it may as well been from today. A couple of years ago, I was doing a program on a radio station in the Appleton area when a woman called up and said, this story isn't old, it's new. I still live on that farm, and my family has experienced many tragedies. So that curse continues on. Now, a lot of you listening and watching tonight, a lot of you are probably married. And without a doubt, you're happily married. But if you know somebody who's not happily married, you may want to tell them to use the excuse this next woman used, because she claimed she had been hypnotized into marriage. And as weird as it sounds, under oath in court, her husband admitted to it, said, yes, indeed, I did hypnotize her into marriage. She was able to get out of the marriage. I don't know how well a judge today would look at this excuse, but you may want to try it out. The last category we're going to talk about this evening is that of UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Skeptics claim that the only reason we believe in UFOs is because of Hollywood. The only reason we see UFOs is because of Hollywood. TV shows like The X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries, movies like Men in Black and Independence Day, that's why we see and believe in UFOs. But what you'll discover here tonight is that people in Wisconsin were seeing odd things in the sky long before Mulder and Scully were out there investigating. It should come as no surprise that we do get reports of UFOs in our state, because not only do we have the UFO capital of the world here, we have 3 of them. The cities of Dundee, Elmwood, and Bellevue all claim to be the UFO capital of the world. All 3 of them have UFO Day festivals every single year that you can go and decide for yourself. But we have a long history of people seeing weird things. Back in 1895 in Green Bay, they saw a big ball of fire, 10 feet and perfectly round, before disappearing after 10 minutes in the sky. And I threw this photo on the bottom, not because it shows Green Bay or a UFO, but it illustrates that people of that era spent more time outside than we do today. Nearly half of them were involved in farming. Today, that's less than 1% of the population. And at night in the summer, they would sit outside waiting for their home to cool off. If it didn't, they slept out in the front yard. So it seems likely that they would see more things in the sky because they spent more time looking at it. Just as an experiment for the next week or so, mentally keep track of how long you spend staring at the night sky. And if you're like a lot of people, especially in winter, is probably not that long. But they would see things like floating object that they thought was not an airship of some sort, not a balloon or a cloud, but something that was moving under intelligent control. And I have dozens and dozens and dozens of these weird lights, strange aircraft hovering around all over the state of Wisconsin. But I'm going to move forward a few decades because this might be the weirdest case of a UFO sighting you'll ever hear about. It happened back in 1961 in Eagle River, Wisconsin, to this gentleman, Joe Simonton, a part-time plumber and a farmer. He was having a late breakfast, early brunch, when all of a sudden he saw this craft start to descend into his yard. He said it was about 30 feet wide, 12 feet high, and had all these little muffler type rings on it. I have to give Simonton credit because he had never given much thought to UFOs. So instead of being scared, he was curious and he walked out to the UFO. There, he said a hatch appeared like the opening of the trunk of your car. And he saw one of the creatures, the human, the inhabitant, the alien, the pilot, whatever it was. He saw one come up to the window. Several others were on board. They were all identical looking. Very short, wearing tight clothing, with dark hair, dark eyes, and darker skin. Simonton said they reminded him of small Italian men. The leader was holding some sort of jug. Without any verbal communication, Simonton realized they wanted water. So he went into his house and filled the jug up with water. When he came back, he handed it to the leader, and he looked inside, and one of the other beings seemed to be cooking something over a flameless type grill or apparatus. Simonton, trying to get some sort of communication going, motioned to his mouth like, "Are you eating? Are you going to eat that?" The leader recognized Simonton's interest, went over and grabbed several of these and traded him for the water. He traded him what the newspapers called alien pancakes or saucer cakes. Simonton ate one of them, said it was the worst tasting pancake he had ever had. He said, "No wonder they're so small. If this is what they're eating, I feel sorry for them." As soon as the trade was completed, the craft door shut as though it was never there, and it flew off into the sky. Simonton had no idea, but other people were seeing UFOs in the area over his farm at the exact moment he was spotting them. Simonton at first didn't want to report it. He knew how it sounded. But when he did, you can't imagine the amount of publicity it received. In the first week, thousands of people showed up to his farm looking for those alien pancakes. Eventually, the U.S. Air Force, Project Blue Book, came to investigate it as well. Simonton claimed that he wished he never would have reported it, that he wished he would have kept his mouth closed. Some say he had other sightings, but he didn't report it. But until the day he died, he believed he had encountered something not of this earth. And he's not alone. Every year, hundreds of people send their reports to my colleague Noah Voss's website, UFO Wisconsin. They've seen something they can't explain in the night sky, or sometimes the day sky. But as I'm running low on time, here's what I hope you take from tonight's program. Because if you turn on your television, you listen to NPR, you read your newspaper, or God forbid you consult the internet, you'll probably say something similar to this: the world has gone crazy. Can you believe how crazy the world is today? And I agree with you. The world is absolutely crazy today. but I hope this program illustrates that the world was crazy 100 years ago as well. It will probably be crazy 100 years from now when they look back at us and say, what the heck were they thinking? So that's what I hope you take from tonight's program. And if you want more information, my website, Chad Lewis Research, has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird place. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I want to thank the library again for having me. It's very rare that you can come to a program like this at no cost. So if you like programs like this one, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like tonight's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a ton of work into getting me here, and they should be applauded. Because I can't think of a time in America's history in which the library has played a more important role than it does today. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, societal issues, the library is the fabric that keeps our communities together. A real treasure for any city that has one. So to show my appreciation, if you're looking to get any of my books on my website, just type in the coupon code library. You'll save 20% off everything just because the library is so amazing. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll turn my camera on and turn it over to the library, and we can field some questions, comments, or stories from any of you if you have any. Or you can unmute yourself and ask your own question or comment. So you can see I am a live person here. Let's see if we have any questions. Any Twilight episodes based in Wisconsin? That I do not know. Strange. Yeah, that's a great one. Do more strange things happen in Wisconsin than most of the other states, including recent times? Well, I believe so. I think Wisconsin's one of the weirdest states, but I found that no matter where you go, if you dig a bit, you'll find some oddity in the area, some weird story. If you're ever bored during a rainy day or let's say a pandemic, I recommend you go through the old newspaper archives. Most of them are online. The library has access to a lot of them. And just dig through the old stories from 100 years ago in your town. You'll be amazed at how much weirdness goes on. And you also start to get a feel of the town. You start seeing the same businesses advertising, the same names coming up, and you really get a sense of what life must have been like 100 years ago wherever you live. Let's see if we have any more questions. A lot of thanking the libraries, definitely. And keep in mind, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many other stories out there that won't fit into an hour-long program. I've done programs on each of these categories by themselves. And that gives you an idea of how much is really out there. People often ask about hauntings in Wisconsin. And yes, it's fun to talk about these cases, and the media covers cases where it's a suicide or a serial killer, or an untimely death, or a murder, or an accident. But the overwhelming majority of people that contact me about a haunting, they believe it's their home. Some of them believe it's a loved one or a family member. They smell grandma's perfume on the anniversary of her death, or grandpa's cigar, and they think it's a loved one that is still in a better place now, and they take comfort and solace in that. So it's people's homes, and believe it or not, a lot of people, it doesn't bother them. They've become accustomed to it, and others think there's no way that could happen. how in the world could you get used to a spirit being in your home? But people tend to do. Another last thing too is I believe the library is recording this. So if you have any friends or family that couldn't make it, or if you have some in-laws you'd like to get even with, you can send them to the library website to watch it again on their own. Otherwise, if the library doesn't have any more announcements.
Hey, yes, thank you for mentioning that this is being recorded. We'll put it on our YouTube, share it on our social media. You'll be able to find it. And one other person noted, she's asking about having you back, which would be great, but I believe on your website, you list where you'll be speaking next. Is that right?
Yes, I have a whole list of my programs, and all the way through at least the fall, they're all going to be virtually. So if you want to hear about other topics, you can tune in from wherever and watch them. You won't have to travel very far at all.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight, and thank you for your kind words about libraries. This was really enjoyable and I learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Keep an eye out.
Awesome. Take care, everybody.